Hi, you're listening to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show podcast. If you're studying the subject at GCSE, A-level, foundation, degree, or any other discipline, then this podcast could be of help to you. If you have a question for the show, then you can email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, and one of the teachers, lecturers, examiners, or experts will answer your question for you. You can sponsor the show on the GoFundMe page and subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms. If you're going to class, going to the gym, or just chilling, put your headphones in and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show. And in this episode, we're going to look at studies and sociologists that you can use for the topic of families and households. In part one, I'm going to run through some 21st century studies, some contemporary studies that you can use and refer to. Some may be in your textbooks, some may be new to you, but these are all examples that you can use in your essays. And then in part two, I'm just going to run through some of the podcast guests that I've had for episodes that you can go back and listen to. And again, you can use these in your essays and workforce sociology. And so the first study that we are going to look at is by a theorist called Levin, and the name of the study is Living Apart Together, a New Family Form. And this piece of research, the book came out in 2004. Now, you may have heard the term LAT before. It is mentioned in many of the textbooks, but LAT, if you're not aware, stands for Living Apart Together. Now, what Levin's research began to do is observe a phenomenon popular with many couples in Scandinavia. And these were people that were in relationships but had their own separate home. In other words, they lived apart together, or LAT. This trend seems to be spreading across many other parts of Europe now too, and Levin notes that to be a couple is no longer dependent upon sharing a common household. It's no longer important for one to be married or to be living in the same household. And what Levin noticed was actually this was certainly a kind of sign of status, actually, that you were in a relationship but you kept your independence. You also had your family home to back onto in case the relationship didn't last, and it was kind of linked to feminism as well, and this increase of independence for women and for men as well. So if you get a question or an essay asking you about different family types, diversity of families, or how households have changed, then refer to this. You probably are aware, as I said, of the term LAT, but use the theorist Levin, and the name of the study, Living Apart Together, a New Family Form, and that's from 2004. Okay, study two. The second study that we're going to look at is by a theorist called Frank Furedi, and the name of the study is Paranoid Parenting, and it's from 2008. Actually, the full title, let me give it. Paranoid Parenting, Why Ignoring the Experts May Be Best for Your Child. Now, there are quite a few questions that come up about whether childhood today is better or worse than it was in the past. And there's lots of sociologists, I'm sure you're aware of them, that you can use on this. Now, one of the arguments Furedi makes is that actually we've become too child-centered. And if we're too child-centered, we become so paranoid and concerned about everything to do with our children that they actually lose their freedom. Now, Furedi first published his research in 2001, and then he wrote an updated version in 2008 because he felt the situation had got even worse. And he argues that the paranoia is getting worse by the year. According to Furedi, the evidence shows that a society is too child-centered, and it actually becomes a hindrance to the experiences and the psychological development of a child. Furedi notes that in recent years, banning children from activities that appear remotely adventurous has become an institution of British political life. So according to Furedi, there are many aspects of children's lives that are much better because we are child-centered. We care about our children a lot more. But actually, we can become too overprotective. And if we are too overprotective, what we're doing is we're limiting the experiences and the developmental process that the child goes through. For example, it's natural for children to be curious and want to take risks. But if they're constantly being restricted from doing those, does that mean that they're not actually picking up and learning? So a really, really good one. If you get that question, is childhood better or worse than it used to be? To what extent has childhood improved? Something like that. A really good counter argument. You can use Frank Furedi's arguments that actually parenting has become more paranoid, and actually this is limiting the psychological and sociological development of our children. So that's Frank Furedi, Paranoid Parenting, Why Ignoring the Experts May Be Best for Your Child, and that's from 2008. And on to study 3. Another common question that comes up within sociology is to what extent do families and households change or adapt? How much have they moved away from the nuclear family? First thing to really pay attention to is if it's asking you about families and households, that you need to get as many different examples in as possible. So a good sociologist to refer to is Chambers. And in 2012, Chambers wrote a book, A Sociology of Family Life. Now, according to Chambers, the family structure has changed considerably in recent times, and Chambers believes this is down to individualization, or what is often referred to as detraditionalization. The research shows how new kinds of intimate relationships, such as post-divorce families, cohabiting couples, friends as a family, same-sex unions, are now much more commonplace than they used to be, particularly in the last 20 to 30 years. The number of transnational couples has also risen significantly in line with globalization. And this means that we've got more dual heritage families, or many families that might have a hybrid identity. And there's been a shift in the technology used in fertility as well, meaning that many people are having children much later. So, really common question, to what extent have families and households diversified? There are a number of different reasons why this has happened, from secularization to change in laws. But if you want a sociologist to back up your argument, then please do use this one, Chambers, A Sociology of Family Life, and that's from 2012. Now, study 4 kind of follows on from the last one in that it looks at a significant change that's happened for a lot of people, particularly within Europe or the Western world. And that is the number of people that are choosing to be solo. So this book is written by Klinenberg, and the name of the study is Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone. This is from 2013. So Klinenberg is a New York University sociologist, and he draws on information from over 300 interviews with both men and women on the spectacular rise of those choosing to live alone today. In many societies, the rate for adults is above 50%. So particularly in somewhere like New York, where Klinenberg was doing his research, there are more people that live alone as an adult than actually live in a couple or a family. Now, Klinenberg found that the majority of those living alone were positive about it. It wasn't seen as pathetic or sad and that you couldn't find someone. Most of them had actively taken that choice to be single or to live alone. And he said that those people are positive, and he argues that if we can afford to live alone, then we actually do so. He said it's often seen as a mark of distinction and not anymore as social failure. If you can afford to buy your own flat, to have your own environment, to pay your own bills, then according to Klinenberg, this is a huge element of social status. It can get a huge amount of credence from doing it. So one of the biggest changes that we can definitely see is this expectation that you have to be married, or certainly you have to be in a relationship, and that you're a failure if you're in your 30s or 40s or 50s and you're not actually living with someone. This is a massive trend that is occurring across the Western world. And so if you want a sociologist to back it up, it's often called creative singledom, by the way, then Klinenberg is the one to use. And I'll give you that study again. So that's Klinenberg, Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone. That's from 2013. Okay, on to study 5, and we're going to look at another one which again is really good for those questions, which is asking about how families, society and relationships and households are changing. And this is a piece of research by Wilby, who conducted a study called Is Monogamy Dead? Rethinking Relationships in the 21st Century, and this is from 2017. Now, what Wilby is interested in is how we got to monogamy. If you think in the past, a long time ago, everyone was polyamorous or polygamous. Everyone slept with other people. And then we hit a period in history, and it does go along with religion, that we started to form monogamous relationships, and the idea that we should only be one-to-one and anything else was a sin. What Wilby was interested in is that there seems to be a bit of a detachment away from that theory, and more people are experimenting with non-monogamous relationships. In this research, Wilby questions whether the traditional idea of one partner for life is disappearing or has actually disappeared altogether already in the Western world. Her research shows that the majority now favour what's called serial monogamy. This means going from one partner, then that relationship ends, and another partner. So they're remaining faithful, but they're often having a series of lots of relationships rather than one partner for life. The reason why Wilby says this happens is that many people now accept that relationships often do not work out, and there is actually a benefit to quitting them if they're not being fulfilled or the individual is not being fulfilled. However, even staying faithful to one partner at a time is difficult in what she calls a Tinder generation. And many are exploring alternative forms of relationships, particularly among the under 25s. So another really, really interesting one to use if you're talking about how relationships have changed. You can also link this to gender, for example. Many people are experimenting more with same-sex relationships or even threesomes or polyamorous relationships, whatever it may be. So if you want anything that's talking about moving away from the family, the nuclear family, the family being a conservative force, then use Wilby. The study is called Is Monogamy Dead? Rethinking Relationships in the 21st Century, and that's from 2017. And then finally, another one which is really good for gender within the family. You often get questions about the changes of roles and relationships, whether we are more symmetrical than we used to be, to what extent do we have segregated or joint conjugal roles. And so a really good example that you can use in reference to this is by the sociologist Rushing and Powell, and they wrote a book called Family Dynamics of the Stay-at-Home Father and Working Mother Relationship from 2015. So I think the title kind of speaks for itself, right? But what they were looking at is those couples, heterosexual couples, that are choosing to take the alternative approach to what we expect. Remember, functionalists talk about the instrumental and the expressive roles. Well, this one flips it on its head, where the mother goes out to work and is the breadwinner, and the father stays at home. Their research is based on qualitative interviews with 20 working mothers who were with a husband who stayed at home. Now, this research offers an interesting insight into the relatively new phenomenon of house husbands. Remember, it's still a very, very small number as a percentage of men that stay at home and do the house husband role. The study indicated that the family dynamic of a working mother and stay-at-home father provided a positive parent-child relationship, enhanced parenting cohesion, and enhanced quality time. Now, what's really interesting is if you're also studying the education topic, we know that females are doing much better than males at GCSE, at A-level, and now more females are going to university than men. Now, if this translates into careers, then it may make sense in the future for there to be more stay-at-home fathers, particularly if the mother is the higher earner with a higher status and more important job. What's really interesting from the research is Rushing and Powell say that there is no evidence to suggest that the family or the children suffer in any manner by the mother being out the house and the father being at home in any way at all. So again, if you want a really good study to show or demonstrate exactly how relationships and particularly gender roles are changing within the family, then use this study. That's Rushing and Powell, Family Dynamics of the Stay-at-Home Father and Working Mother Relationship, and that's from 2015. That's going to be the end of part one. Hope you found some of those studies really, really useful. Make a note of those. In part two, I'm going to run you through some of the interviews and podcasts that you can use for the families and households topic.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Hello and welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. This is a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show where we're looking at studies and sociologists that you can use for the topic of families and households. And so I just wanted to run through with you 6 interviews that I've done. Now, maybe you've listened to these before. I don't know how far back on my back catalogue you've listened to, but if you haven't, these are all really useful ones to use for the families and households topic. So the first one that we're going to start with is a really obvious one, Sue Palmer. And this interview, if you look back through, it's from April 2020. You're probably aware of Sue Palmer. She appears across all of the textbooks. If you've got any question given to you about the topic of childhood, then Sue Palmer is really, really important to use. She talks about her book, Toxic Childhood. Okay, so if you want to do anything about the negative experience of children living in the world today, then please do that. And she's also written a book called Upstart, where she argues that the school leaving age should be increased so that children spend more time with their families before they're pushed into some form of full-time education. So go back and listen to this one. Sue Palmer is such an important theorist, such an important writer. Toxic Childhood is such an important text as well. She gives almost an hour interview with me. So go back and have a listen to that one. That's from April 2020. The next one that will be worth listening to is if you get a question on anything to do with the negative side of the family, or what's often called the dark side of the family. And this interview I conducted in October 2020 with Dr. Alicia Walker. Now, this is a controversial one. Many people were quite shocked when they listened to this because it's all about affairs. Alicia Walker researches those people that have affairs within marriage. Now, what's really interesting is she's written 2 books, one from the male point of view and one from the female point of view. So in the male point of view, she talks to and interviews men who have had affairs, and she gives the reasons why they do. It's really, really interesting. And likewise, she's done it from the female point of view. Okay, so those women that are married and have affairs as well. And of all of the episodes that I've done, this is one that got a lot of interest, okay? Because the results from Dr. Walker's research might not be what you think in terms of why both men and women do actually commit affairs within marriage. So if you want something to do with the breakdown of the family, or you want something to do with divorce, because that topic obviously comes up, or cheating, or relationships not working, the dark side of the family, anything like that, then go back and listen to that one. Dr. Alicia Walker, that's from October 2020. Then on the theme of childhood again, they've got 2 different interviewees that I've got here, one very much from the male point of view and one from the female point of view. And both of these researchers look at those people that are childless. Now, sometimes this can be childless through choice. Sometimes it's childless through consequences. And even me saying childless is probably wrong, because quite often the phrase child-free is used rather than childless. So from the women's point of view, Dr. Sheila Quaid talks about childless women or child-free women. Now, in this interview, she talks to women who have chosen not to have children. Some people have never, ever had any inclination or maternal desire to have children. And she talks to and interviews quite a few women who have made that choice. And that's really, really interesting. And she does also talk to women who wanted children, but it never happened, or maybe because of biological factors, they couldn't have children as well. And what's really interesting from Dr. Sheila Quaid's work is just the stigma attached to women that don't have children, particularly if those women are in their 40s or 50s. And when they go to parties and social gatherings and so on, the first question, have you got children? How old are your children? What do they do? Which uni do they go to? That there's quite often a shock, a social shock, if a woman of a certain age doesn't have children. And likewise, as another piece of research, I interviewed Dr. Robin Hadley, and he looks at male childlessness. And so again, these are talking about men without children for various different reasons. In many cases, it just never happened. Many men thought they were always going to have children, and it just got later and later and later. It never occurred, or they never met a partner that they wanted to have children with. And so he puts a really interesting spin on it in terms of what it means to be male and childless. And again, what's really interesting is society's kind of judgment or expectation of men that don't have children. You know, we think of the man going for a walk in the park on his own. We often think of those men as being dodgy or paedophilic simply because they are the odd bloke that lives alone that doesn't have a family. So in both of those interviews, it's really interesting how society judges and stereotypes and looks upon people that do not have children. So that's Dr. Sheila Quaid, that's from July 2020, and Dr. Robin Hadley, and that one's from September 2020. Okay, next one that's worth a listen to is Dr. Alia Ray. This is from July 2020. And Dr. Alia Ray looks at unemployment and the impacts of unemployment on families. What's really interesting on this one, I think, is it's very good for families and gender. What she noticed from her research was that if a female is unemployed within the family, then the way in which it's treated is that she's just out of work or she's concentrating on childcare, and there's not this huge rush to get back into work. She may look for some part-time work or something else that she can find until she goes back to in full-time employment. In other words, it's not seen as shocking. Compare that to when the male is out of work. And this is a huge importance, that he's expected to get back into work as soon as possible, back into another position of status, ideally a job that pays the same, if not more money. And there's a push both for himself to try and get himself back into work, but also from the wife expecting him to get back as soon as possible. So this is really interesting from the ideas of the instrumental role that actually for many families, particularly when a family is going through a level of unemployment or a period of unemployment, that there's much more expectancy for the man to get back to work as soon as possible. And often his desire or need to get back to work is prioritized over that of the female. And lastly, one more that I think you could go back and listen to. This is Dr. Anna Tarrant. This one's from August 2020. And Dr. Tarrant's work looks at fathers and grandfathers' relationship with children. There's a lot of research about mothers and children and the bond that mothers and children make, and early socialization, and how women use the expressive role to bring up the children in primary socialization. But there's not a huge amount about the connection and relationship between fathers and their children. And so this is a really, really interesting piece of research. And what is most noticeable from Dr. Tarrant's work is that this is changing. It's one of the areas that's changing. More and more fathers want to work from home or spend longer with their children or work less hours or even stay at home for a longer period of time, take longer paternity leave. And also the number of grandfathers that want to be very, very active in their grandchildren's lives as well is massively increasing as well. So this is another really good one for anything to do with gender in the family. So that's Dr. Anna Tarrant. That one's from August 2020. So if you are at the moment researching, studying, or going back doing anything to do with the families and households topic, I hope you found this of some use. So there's 6 different studies that you can refer to there in your essays. And I've also given you 6 different podcasts that you can go back and listen to in your own time. Take care and thank you for listening.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.